The widow, standing in the Undertaker's dim parlor, had eyes like storm clouds, and when she opened her mouth to speak, Orion Oakridge knew he was about to witness something that would haunt him. It was the spring of 1878 in Belmont, Nevada, and death had become as common as dust in this silver mining town perched in the Takoma Range. But even for a man who spent most of his time in the mountains trapping and hunting, this moment felt different. "A pauper's grave will do just fine," the Undertaker said, his thin fingers drumming on the pine counter between them. "Your husband has no money to his name, Mrs. Carter, and you certainly cannot afford anything more elaborate. The town will cover the cost of burial, but we do not waste resources on those who contributed nothing." Orion had only come into town to trade his furs and stock up on supplies before heading back into the mountains for the summer months. He stood near the doorway of the general store next door, but the raised voices had drawn his attention. Through the window connecting the two establishments, he could see the young woman's shoulders stiffen, could see the way her hands trembled as she clutched a worn shawl around her thin frame. "My husband was a good man," she said, and her voice cracked like ice on a warming river. "He deserves better than to be thrown into an unmarked hole like he never existed." The Undertaker, a man named Silas Greer, who had grown fat on the profits of death, waved a dismissive hand. "What he deserved and what you can provide are two different matters entirely. If you had the $12 for a proper headstone and burial plot, we would not be having this conversation. As it stands, the pauper's field is generous enough." Orion watched the woman's face crumble, watched her fight to maintain composure, even as tears began to track down her dirt-smudged cheeks. She could not have been more than 22 or 23 years old, young enough that widowhood seemed a cruel joke, young enough that the black dress she wore hung on her like borrowed clothes from someone else's tragedy. Something in his chest tightened, something he had thought long dead after years of solitude in the mountains. Before he could think better of it, before reason could catch up with impulse, Orion was pushing through the connecting door into the Undertaker's parlor. "I will pay for it," he said, his voice rougher than he intended from weeks of disuse. Both the Undertaker and the young widow turned to stare at him, and Orion became acutely aware of how he must look, all 6 feet and 4 inches of him, his buckskin clothes still carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine, his dark hair falling past his shoulders, his beard untrimmed and wild. His hands were calloused and scarred, his shoulders broad enough to fill the doorway, and he knew the muscles of his arms were visible even through his shirt. He was not a man built for polite society, but for survival. "I beg your pardon," Greer said, his eyebrows climbing toward his receding hairline. "The headstone and proper burial," Orion repeated, stepping further into the room. "I will pay for it. $12, you said?" The widow's eyes went wide, and up close, Orion could see they were the color of creek water over stones, gray-green and startling in her pale face. "Sir, I cannot accept charity from a stranger." "It is not charity," Orion said, though he had no idea why he was doing this or what he would say next. "It is what is right. No man should be forgotten just because his pockets were empty when he died." Greer recovered from his surprise quickly, his expression shifting to something calculating. "Well, if you have the money, I certainly have no objection. $12 will secure a plot in the main cemetery, a proper pine coffin with brass fittings, and a limestone headstone with inscription." Orion reached into the leather pouch at his belt and counted out the coins, the sum representing nearly 2 months of trapping. He had planned to use it for a new rifle, but as he met the widow's eyes again, saw the confusion and gratitude warring there, he knew he could not walk away. "What name should go on the stone?" Greer asked, suddenly all business as he swept the coins into his cash box. "Thomas Carter," the widow whispered. "He was 30 years old. He died in the mine collapse last week." Orion remembered hearing about that disaster. 5 men had died when a support beam gave way in the silver mine that kept Belmont alive. The town had mourned publicly for about a day before moving on, too busy surviving to dwell long on death. "It will be ready by tomorrow afternoon," Greer said. "The burial can take place at sunset, if that suits you, Mrs. Carter." She nodded, still staring at Orion like she could not quite believe he was real. "Thank you," she managed. "I do not know how I can ever repay you." "No repayment needed," Orion said, uncomfortable with the gratitude shining in her eyes. He turned to leave, eager to escape back to the mountains where things made sense, where the rules were simple and emotions did not complicate every interaction. "Wait," she called after him, and he paused at the door. "At least tell me your name, so I know who to thank in my prayers." "Orion Oakridge," he said over his shoulder, "but prayers are not necessary, madam." He left before she could say anything else, his heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the way her voice had wrapped around the word, "thank you." Back in the general store, he quickly purchased his supplies, ignoring the curious looks from the proprietor who had undoubtedly overheard everything. That night, Orion made camp just outside of town rather than heading immediately back into the mountains. He told himself it was because his horse needed rest, that it made sense to start fresh in the morning, but as he lay in his bedroll staring up at the stars scattered across the Nevada sky, he knew he was lying to himself. Something about that woman, about the widow Carter with her storm-cloud eyes and proud bearing despite her poverty, had lodged itself under his skin like a splinter he could not extract. He found himself thinking about her hands, how small they had looked clutching that shawl, how the wedding ring on her finger was just a simple band of tarnished silver. He thought about the way she had held herself together in front of Greer, refusing to beg despite her desperation. There was strength in her, the kind that came from enduring things that should have broken her. Orion had been alone for nearly 8 years, ever since he left his family's farm in Missouri to head west in search of something he could never quite name. He had tried his hand at mining, at cattle work, at every kind of labor the frontier offered before finally finding his place in the mountains. He was good at solitude, good at the silence that came with tracking game through forests so thick the sunlight barely penetrated. He had convinced himself he did not need anything else, that the complications of human connection were better left behind. But now, staring up at those indifferent stars, he felt the weight of his loneliness like never before. What must it be like, he wondered, to have someone love you enough to fight for your memory after death? What must it be like to matter that much to another human being? The next afternoon, Orion found himself riding back into Belmont, his supplies still packed on his horse, his plans to return to the mountains temporarily abandoned. He told himself he just wanted to make sure Greer followed through on his promise, that the widow Carter got what she paid for, even if technically he was the one who had paid for it. But as he dismounted near the small cemetery on the edge of town, he knew he was still lying to himself. The widow was already there, standing alone beside a fresh grave. She had changed into a different black dress, one that fit her better, and her dark blonde hair was pulled back severely from her face. She looked so small and solitary against the backdrop of the desert mountains, so fragile that Orion felt that strange tightening in his chest again. She turned when she heard his boots on the rocky ground, and surprise flickered across her face. "Mr. Oakridge, I did not expect to see you again." "I wanted to make sure everything was in order," he said gruffly, stopping a respectful distance away. "That Undertaker struck me as the type who might cut corners if he thought no one was watching." A faint smile touched her lips, though it did not reach her eyes. "That is perceptive of you. Silas Greer is known for exactly that, but he seems to have done right by Thomas. The headstone is beautiful." Orion looked at the limestone marker, simple but dignified, with Thomas Carter's name and dates carved cleanly into the surface. Below that, someone had added, "Beloved husband, taken too soon." "Did you choose those words?" he asked. She nodded. "Greer said I could have up to 6 additional words at no extra charge. I wanted Thomas to know he was loved, even though he is not here to hear it." Before Orion could respond, a small group began to gather for the burial. A few miners who had worked alongside Thomas, a woman who ran the boarding house where the Carters had lived, and a preacher whose tired face suggested he had presided over far too many funerals lately. They were all the mourners Thomas Carter would have, all the witnesses to his final journey. The service was brief, the words familiar and worn smooth from repetition. Orion stood at the back of the small gathering, watching as the widow stood straight and silent, watching as they lowered the coffin into the ground, watching as she finally broke and wept when the first shovelful of dirt hit the wood. When it was over, and the others had drifted away with murmured condolences, Orion found himself walking toward her. She was still standing beside the grave, her hands clasped in front of her, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and the raw grief on her face made him wish he knew what to say, wish he had words that could ease even a fraction of her pain. "Mr. Oakridge, thank you for coming. It means more than you know, having someone here who cared enough to give Thomas dignity in death. How long were you married?" The question came out before he could stop it. 3 years, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We met in Sacramento, where I was working as a seamstress. Thomas was convinced we could make our fortune in the Nevada silver fields, so I followed him here last year. We were saving money to buy a little piece of land, to start a farm somewhere quieter. He was going to quit the mines as soon as we had enough." The story was heartbreakingly common in the boom towns scattered across the West. So many people chasing dreams of wealth, so many lives cut short by the brutal reality of that chase. "Do you have family?" Orion asked. "Someone who can help you now?" She shook her head. "My parents died when I was 16. I have a sister in California, but we have not spoken in years. Thomas was all I had." Her voice broke on his name, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as if she could force the grief back down. "What will you do now?" The question was too personal, Orion knew, but he could not seem to stop himself from asking. "I do not know," she admitted, and the honesty in her answer struck him hard. "The boarding house wants payment for the room, but I have nothing to give them. Thomas's wages died with him. I suppose I will have to find work, but there is not much available for a woman alone in a mining town." Orion knew exactly what kind of work was available for women without resources in places like Belmont, and the thought of this woman ending up in one of the saloons or brothels that lined the main street made something fierce and protective rise up in him. "You said you were a seamstress," he said quickly. "Is that something you could do here?" "Perhaps, but I would need supplies, fabric and thread and needles. I have none of that anymore. We sold everything we could spare just to pay for food these last months. The mine was not paying regularly, and Thomas kept saying it would get better, that we just had to hold on a little longer." She laughed, a bitter sound. "I suppose he held on as long as he could." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed too beautiful for such a somber occasion. Orion knew he should leave, should get on his horse and ride back to his cabin in the mountains and forget about the widow with storm cloud eyes, but he could not make himself move. "I have a proposition," he heard himself say, and then he was committed, the words tumbling out before caution could silence them. "I have a cabin about 15 miles north of here, up in the mountains. It is nothing fancy, but it is sturdy and warm and safe. There is good water and plenty of game. I'm usually only there a few months out of the year, spending most of my time moving between trap lines, but I'm planning to stay put for a while this summer to make some repairs." She was staring at him now, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I do not understand what you are proposing, Mr. Oakridge." He took a breath, aware he was about to suggest something that could easily be misunderstood. "I am proposing that you come stay at the cabin as my housekeeper. You would have your own room, complete privacy, and in exchange for cooking and mending and keeping the place in order, I would provide food and shelter and protection. It would give you time to figure out your next step without having to worry about immediate survival." Color flooded her pale cheeks. "Sir, I appreciate your generosity, but I cannot possibly accept such an arrangement. It would not be proper." "I know how it sounds," Orion said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But I am not proposing anything improper. You need help, and I happen to be in a position to offer it. There is no one around for miles to pass judgment, and frankly, I could use the help. I am decent at surviving in the wilderness, but my cooking is terrible, and my clothes are held together more by hope than stitching." She bit her lip, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. "Why would you do this for a stranger? First the headstone, now this. I do not understand." Orion was not sure he understood it himself, but he tried to explain. "I spent a long time not caring about much beyond my next meal and my next pelt. Seeing you yesterday, seeing someone fight so hard to preserve dignity and respect for someone they loved, it reminded me that there are things worth caring about. If I can help you, maybe that means something. Maybe that gives my life out here more purpose than just existing." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time there was something else mixed in with the grief. "You are either the kindest man I have ever met, or the most foolish." "Probably both," he admitted, and was rewarded with a faint smile. She looked back at the grave, at the headstone bearing her husband's name, and Orion could see the war playing out on her face. Finally, she spoke, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear. "If I accept, it would only be temporary, just until I can save enough to get myself established somewhere. And we would need clear boundaries, clear expectations. I am recently widowed, Mr. Oakridge. My heart is not available, and I will not dishonor Thomas's memory by entertaining inappropriate advances." "I understand completely," Orion said, relief flooding through him, though he could not quite name what he was relieved about. "You have my word as a gentleman that I will treat you with complete respect. You will be safe with me, Mrs. Carter, I swear it." She studied his face for a long moment, and Orion had the strange sensation of being seen, really seen, in a way he had not experienced in years. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she finally nodded. "Very well. I accept your offer, Mr. Oakridge. When would we leave?" "Tomorrow morning, if you are ready. Is there anything you need to collect from the boarding house?" "Just a small trunk with my clothes and a few personal items. Thomas's things." She paused, swallowing hard. "Thomas's things can stay. I cannot bear to take them with me." "I will meet you at the boarding house at first light," Orion said. "We will need to get an early start. The trail to the cabin is not difficult, but it takes most of a day." She nodded, and then, surprising him, she extended her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Oakridge, truly. You have been kinder to me than I had any right to expect." Her hand was small and cold in his much larger one, and Orion was careful to keep his grip gentle. "You can call me Orion, if you would be comfortable with that." "Then you should call me Clara," she said softly. "Clara Calloway Carter." That night Clara lay awake in the small room at the boarding house, staring at the water-stained ceiling and wondering if she had lost her mind. In the span of 2 days, she had buried her husband and agreed to go live in a mountain cabin with a stranger who looked like he had walked out of some wild legend, all muscle and leather and rough edges. But what choice did she have? Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, had already made it clear that Clara had until the end of the week to either pay rent or vacate. The few women in town who might have taken her in were barely surviving themselves. And the alternative, working in one of the saloons, was unthinkable. She had heard the stories, seen what happened to women who took that path. They aged quickly in those places, their spirits breaking along with their bodies. No, Orion Oakridge's offer, strange as it was, represented her best chance at survival. She thought about the way he had looked at her, not with the predatory interest she had grown accustomed to from other men in town, but with something closer to concern, maybe even compassion. He had kind eyes, she had noticed, despite the harsh lines of his face and the sheer physical presence of him. When he had promised she would be safe, she had believed him. Still, as she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, she found herself whispering an apology to Thomas, hoping he would understand, hoping he would not think she was betraying his memory by accepting help from another man so soon after laying him in the ground. The morning came too quickly, arriving with weak sunlight and the sounds of the town waking around her. Clara dressed in her least worn dress, a simple gray cotton that was more practical than her morning blacks, and packed her few possessions into the trunk Thomas had bought her as a wedding present. There was not much. A few changes of clothes, her sewing kit, a daguerreotype of her parents, and the letters Thomas had written her during their courtship. Everything else they had owned had been sold or lost. Orion was waiting outside when she came down, his massive frame making the boarding house's narrow porch look even smaller. He had a sturdy pack horse with him in addition to his own mount, and he took her trunk without comment, securing it efficiently to the pack saddle. "Can you ride?" he asked. "A little," Clara admitted, "though it has been some time." "We will take it slow. My horse is gentle, and I will be right beside you the whole way." He helped her mount, his hands steadying her with easy strength, and Clara tried not to think about how small she felt next to him, how aware she was of the solid muscle of his arms as he lifted her into the saddle. They left Belmont as the sun climbed higher, heading north into the foothills of the Takuma Range. The landscape was harsh but beautiful in its own way, all sage and stone and distant peaks still capped with snow despite the warming season. Orion kept his word, maintaining a pace that was easy for Clara to manage, and he talked to her occasionally, pointing out landmarks and wildlife, giving her mind something to focus on besides grief and uncertainty. "That is where I usually set my trap lines in winter," he said, gesturing toward a distant canyon. "The beaver are thick there, and I can usually count on a good take." "How long have you been living out here?" Clara asked, genuinely curious about this man who had appeared in her life like something from a fever dream. 8 years, give or take. I came west when I was 20, thinking I would strike it rich in the gold fields. Turns out I'm much better at trapping and hunting than mining. The mountains suited me better anyway. Too many people down in the towns, too much noise and complication. Do you never get lonely?" He was quiet for a moment, and Clara worried she had overstepped. "Sometimes," he finally said, "but loneliness seemed safer than the alternative. People leave, or they die, or they disappoint you. Out here, there is only myself to rely on." There was a story in those words, Clara sensed, some old hurt that had driven him into isolation. But she did not press. She understood about pain that went too deep for casual conversation. They stopped at midday to rest the horses and eat the simple meal of bread and dried meat that Orion had packed. Clara sat on a flat rock and looked out over the valley below, feeling strangely untethered, like she had left her old life so far behind that it no longer had any claim on her. "Are you all right?" Orion asked, settling onto a nearby boulder. Even sitting, he was imposing, his shoulders broad enough to block the sun. "I am not sure," Clara said honestly. "Everything feels unreal. 3 days ago, I was a married woman making plans for the future. Now Thomas is dead, and I'm riding into the wilderness with a man I barely know. It is like I have stepped into someone else's life." "You can still change your mind," Orion said carefully. "I can take you back to Belmont if that is what you want, or we can keep going to the cabin, stay a few days, and if you are uncomfortable, I will bring you back. No questions, no judgment." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the strong planes of his face, the way his dark hair fell around his shoulders, the obvious power in his frame that he seemed to hold carefully in check, as if aware that he could be frightening if he was not cautious. There was something reassuring about that carefulness, about the way he seemed determined to give her choices, to let her maintain some control over her situation. "No," she said. "I want to keep going. I need to keep going. There is nothing left for me in Belmont except memories I am not ready to face." He nodded, accepting her decision without further comment, and they continued on. The cabin appeared in late afternoon, nestled in a small valley between two ridges, surrounded by tall pines and aspens that whispered in the wind. It was larger than Clara had expected, built of solid logs and chinked carefully against the weather. A small stream ran nearby, and there was a corral for the horses that had clearly been built with care. "It is not much," Orion said as he helped her dismount, and Clara could hear a note of uncertainty in his voice, like he was suddenly seeing his home through her eyes and finding it wanting. "It is wonderful," she said, and meant it. After the cramped, dirty room at the boarding house, after months of poverty and worry, the cabin looked like sanctuary. Inside, the main room was dominated by a stone fireplace, with a simple kitchen area along one wall and a table with 2 chairs. There were 2 doors leading off the main room, and Orion opened one to reveal a small bedroom with a rope bed covered in furs and quilts. "This will be your room," he said. "I will take the loft." He pointed to a ladder leading up to a sleeping area above the main room. "There is a screen you can pull across for privacy when you are bathing or changing. The privy is out back, and the stream is cold but clean for washing." Clara walked around the cabin, taking it all in. It was rustic, certainly, but there was an order to it that spoke of a man who took pride in his surroundings despite his isolation. The floors were swept, the dishes were clean if mismatched, and everything had its place. "You have made a good home here," she said, turning back to Orion. "Thank you for sharing it with me." Something in his expression softened, and for a moment Clara caught a glimpse of the man he might have been before, whatever happened to send him into the mountains. "You are welcome here, Clara. I meant what I said about you being safe. Whatever you need, whatever you want, you only have to ask." Over the next few weeks, they settled into a routine that surprised Clara with its easy comfort. She woke early to make breakfast, simple fare of eggs from the chickens Orion kept, and bread she learned to bake in the Dutch oven. While he went out to check his trap lines or hunt for fresh meat, She cleaned and mended and learned the rhythms of life in the wilderness. It was harder work than she had expected, but there was something satisfying about it, about seeing the direct results of her labor. The clothes she mended stayed mended. The food she cooked sustained them. The cabin she kept clean stayed clean. There was a logic to it that the chaos of her life in Belmont had lacked, and Orion, for all his rough exterior, proved to be a considerate housemate. He was true to his word about respecting her privacy, making sure to announce himself before entering rooms, never coming too close unless she invited it. He was also surprisingly easy to talk to once Clara got past her initial shyness. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Clara would sew while Orion worked on various projects, cleaning his weapons or repairing equipment. Sometimes they talked, sharing stories of their pasts, and Clara found herself looking forward to these conversations, to the quiet intimacy of two people learning each other. "Tell me about Missouri," she said one night, her fingers working steadily on a tear in one of his shirts. Orion was sharpening his hunting knife, the rhythmic sound of whetstone on steel soothing in its regularity. "Not much to tell. I grew up on a farm, the youngest of 4 brothers. My father was a hard man, thought affection was weakness. My mother tried her best, but she was worn down by work and childbearing. When I turned 20, I realized I would either spend the rest of my life breaking my back on land that would never really be mine, or I could head west and see what else the world had to offer." "Do you miss them, your family?" He paused in his sharpening, considering the question. "Sometimes. But we were never close, not really. My brothers all took after our father, saw me as weak because I liked to read, because I asked questions instead of just accepting the way things were. Leaving was both a choice and an escape." "I understand that," Clara said softly. "My sister was always the pretty one, the charming one. My parents doted on her while I was expected to be practical and useful. When they died and left us a small inheritance, she spent her share on pretty dresses and parties, while I tried to make mine last. We fought about it constantly. Eventually, she ran off with a gambler, and I have not heard from her since. Do you worry about her?" "Every day. But I learned that you cannot save someone who does not want to be saved. You can only make the best choices you can for your own life." Orion looked at her across the fire, and the expression on his face was unreadable. "You're very wise for someone so young." Clara felt her cheeks heat. "I am not that young. I will be 24 next month." 24, he repeated. "I am 28. Feels like I have lived a lot longer than that, though." "The frontier ages us all quickly," Clara agreed. As the days turned into weeks, Clara found herself thinking less and less about returning to civilization. The cabin in the mountains had become a haven, a place where she could breathe without the weight of grief crushing her chest. She still thought about Thomas, still mourned him, but the sharp edge of that pain was beginning to dull into something more bearable. What surprised her more, though, was how aware she had become of Orion. She found herself noticing small things, the way he smiled when she managed to cook something particularly well, the care with which he handled the horses, the strength evident in every movement of his large frame. She noticed how his hair caught the light, how his hands, despite their size and the scars they bore, could be surprisingly gentle. It was unsettling, this growing awareness. She felt guilty for it, felt like she was betraying Thomas's memory by even noticing another man, but she could not seem to help herself. Orion, for his part, was struggling with his own realizations. Having Clara in his cabin had changed everything in ways he had not anticipated. The space felt more like a home now, warmer and more alive with her presence in it. He found himself hurrying through his work so he could get back to the cabin sooner, found himself looking forward to their evening conversations with an eagerness that both pleased and troubled him. He knew he was developing feelings for her, feelings that went beyond simple attraction or loneliness. There was something about Clara's strength, about the way she faced her grief with dignity, about her quick mind and quicker smile that called to something deep in his soul. But she was a widow, recently bereaved, and she had trusted him to provide sanctuary without expecting anything in return. The last thing he wanted was to make her uncomfortable or to abuse that trust. So he kept his distance, maintained careful boundaries, even as every instinct screamed at him to draw closer, to offer comfort, to tell her she was not alone. The breaking point came about 6 weeks after Clara arrived at the cabin. Orion had gone out early to hunt, hoping to bring back a deer before the heat of the day set in. He was successful, managing to take down a young buck with a clean shot, and was in the process of field dressing it when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A mountain lion's scream, close enough that he could feel it in his bones. Orion abandoned the deer immediately, grabbing his rifle and running back toward the cabin. Mountain lions were rare in this area, but when they did show up, they were dangerous, especially if they were hungry or protecting territory. And Clara was alone at the cabin, unprotected, probably unaware of the danger. He burst through the tree line to see the big cat circling the chicken coop, where Clara stood with a broom, trying to protect the birds. His heart nearly stopped. The lion was a female, probably full-grown, and she looked thin, desperate enough to risk coming this close to human habitation. "Clara!" he shouted. "Get in the cabin, now!" But Clara, brave and foolish in equal measure, did not run. "The chickens!" she called back. "I cannot just leave them." The lion's attention snapped to Orion, recognizing him as the greater threat. She crouched, muscles bunching, preparing to either attack or flee. Orion raised his rifle, hating that he might have to kill such a magnificent creature, but knowing he would not hesitate if it meant protecting Clara. "Easy," he said, his voice low and steady. "You do not want to do this. There's a deer carcass about a quarter-mile east. Fresh kill. Go take that and leave us alone." For a long, tense moment, the three of them were frozen in a tableau of potential violence. Then, miracle of miracles, the lion seemed to decide that discretion was the better part of valor. She turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with liquid grace. Orion did not lower the rifle until he was certain she was gone. Then he whirled on Clara, fear transmuting into anger. "What were you thinking? That animal could have killed you." Clara's face was pale, but her chin lifted stubbornly. "I was thinking that we need those chickens, and I was not going to let some cat have them for breakfast." "Chickens can be replaced," Orion said, his voice rough with residual terror. "You cannot. Do you understand that? If something happened to you out here, if you were hurt or killed, it would be my fault for bringing you here." "I am not your responsibility," Clara shot back, but her voice was shaking now. "I make my own choices." "The hell you are not my responsibility," Orion said, closing the distance between them. "From the moment I paid for your husband's headstone, from the moment I brought you to this cabin, you became my responsibility. I will not let anything happen to you, Clara. I cannot." They were standing very close now, close enough that he could see the rapid pulse in her throat, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. Her eyes were wide, and there was something in them beyond fear, something that made his breath catch. "Why do you care so much?" she whispered. "I'm just a stranger you helped out of pity." "It was never pity," Orion said, and the truth was pulling itself out of him like splinters from a wound. "From the first moment I saw you, fighting to give your husband dignity in death, I knew you were someone extraordinary. And every day since then, you have proven me right. You are brave and kind and strong. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as my housekeeper and started thinking of you as something much more important." Clara's hand came up to rest on his chest, right over his heart. He could feel it pounding against her palm. "Orion," she said, and his name had never sounded like that before, like a question and an answer all at once. "I know it is too soon," he said quickly. "I know you are still grieving, and I have no right to say these things to you. But I needed you to know that you matter to me, Clara. You matter more than anything has mattered to me in a very long time." Tears were sliding down her cheeks, but she was smiling, a tremulous, tentative smile that made his heart soar. "It is too soon," she agreed. "I love Thomas, and I'm not ready to let that go. But you matter to me too, Orion. You have given me back my life when I thought I had nothing left. And I think maybe, if we are careful, if we are patient, there might be something here worth exploring. Not now, but someday." "Someday," Orion repeated, the word feeling like a promise. "I can wait for someday, Clara. I can wait as long as you need." She leaned into him then, just for a moment, letting him wrap his arms around her, letting herself be held. And standing there in the mountain sunshine with this woman who had changed everything, Orion felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. The summer deepened, days stretching long and warm across the mountain valley. True to his word, Orion did not push Clara for more than she was ready to give. But the dynamic between them had shifted after the mountain lion incident, becoming something richer and more complex. They were more comfortable with casual touches now, hands brushing when they passed dishes at meals, shoulders touching when they sat together on the cabin's small porch in the evenings. Clara found herself seeking out these small contacts, finding comfort in the solid reality of Orion's presence. She was also learning more about the man behind the rugged exterior. He was surprisingly well-read, with a small collection of books that he had hauled into the mountains over the years. They began reading aloud to each other in the evenings, sharing passages from worn copies of Shakespeare and Emerson, debating philosophy and meaning in ways that made Clara's mind feel alive and engaged. "I never would have guessed you were a scholar," she teased one evening as Orion finished reading a particularly moving passage from Walden. "I am no scholar," he protested, but he was smiling. "Just a man who likes to think. There's plenty of time for thinking up here." "Too much time, perhaps. Do you never worry about going a bit mad from the isolation?" "I worried about that the first year," he admitted, "but I learned that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. I was content with my own company. Or at least, I was until you showed up and reminded me what I was missing." Clara felt her cheeks warm. These moments of honesty between them were becoming more frequent, acknowledgments of the feelings growing like wildflowers in the spaces between words. In mid-July, a traveling merchant made his way up to the cabin, a grizzled old man named Pete, who had been trading with Orion for years. He brought news from Belmont and supplies Orion had requested. "Heard about you having a woman up here," Pete said with a knowing wink as he unpacked his wares. "Caused quite a stir in town. Folks saying all kinds of things about Oakridge the Hermit finally taking a wife." "Mrs. Carter is my housekeeper, not my wife," Orion said firmly, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. Sure, Pete said, clearly not believing a word of it. "Whatever you say. But you should know that Undertaker fellow Greer. He's been spreading some nasty rumors, saying you took advantage of a grieving widow, that kind of thing." Clara felt anger flash through her. "Mr. Greer can say whatever he likes. The truth is that Mr. Oakridge has been nothing but respectful and kind. He saved my life." Pete held up his hands in surrender. "Hey, I'm not judging. Just thought you should know what is being said. Also brought the supplies you asked for, Orion, including that fabric and sewing notions for the lady." Orion had ordered supplies for her, Clara realized with a warm rush of gratitude. Fabric so she could make new clothes, thread and needles so she could continue her work. He was always thinking of her comfort, always trying to make her life easier. After Pete left, they unpacked the supplies together, and Clara could not contain her excitement over the bolts of calico and muslin, the spools of thread in every color. "This is too much," she said, running her fingers over the fabric. "This must have cost a fortune." "You needed it," Orion said simply. "And I thought you might like to have something to work on, something that was yours." Impulsively, Clara stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, a brief press of lips against the rough stubble there. "Thank you," she whispered. Orion froze, his hand coming up to touch where she had kissed him, and the look on his face was one of such wonder that Clara felt something crack in her chest, some last wall she'd been holding on to crumbling. She was falling in love with him, she realized. Somewhere between the morning conversations over coffee and the evening readings by the fire, somewhere between his patient teaching about the wilderness and his careful respect for her grief, she had started falling. And the realization both terrified and exhilarated her. That night, unable to sleep, Clara slipped out of her room to find Orion sitting by the dying fire, staring into the embers. He looked up when he heard her approach. "Could not sleep?" he asked softly. "Too many thoughts," she admitted, settling into the chair beside him. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Why did you really help me that day in town? The real reason, not the polite answer you gave before." Orion was quiet for a long time, and Clara waited, knowing this was important, knowing she needed to understand. "I saw myself in you," he finally said. "Not the circumstances, but the feeling of being alone, of having the world treat you like you did not matter. When I left home, I was running from people who made me feel invisible, worthless. I spent years in these mountains telling myself I did not need anyone, that I was better off alone. But watching you fight for your husband's dignity, watching you refuse to give up even when everything seemed hopeless, it made me realize I had been lying to myself." He turned to look at her, and the firelight cast shadows across his strong features. You made me want to be part of the world again, Clara. You made me want to matter to someone. And then, when I got to know you, when I saw your strength and your kindness and your courage, I started wanting you specifically. Not just someone, but you. Clara's heart was thundering in her chest. I'm afraid, she whispered. Of me? No, of this, of what I am starting to feel. Thomas has only been gone 3 months. What kind of person does that make me, that I could develop feelings for someone else so quickly? It makes you human, Orion said gently. Grief does not follow a schedule, Clara. Neither does healing. Thomas would not want you to spend the rest of your life alone and miserable. He loved you. That means he would want you to be happy. How do you know what he would want? Because that is what I would want if our positions were reversed. If I loved someone, truly loved them, I would want them to live fully, even after I was gone, especially after I was gone. Clara felt tears sliding down her face, but they were not entirely sad tears. I do not want to forget him, she said. You will not, Orion assured her. He will always be part of your story, part of what shaped you, but that does not mean your story has to end with him. You can honor his memory and still build a new life. Those things are not mutually exclusive. Clara looked at this man who had somehow become essential to her in such a short time, this mountain man with his rough hands and kind heart, and she made a decision. I am not ready for everything, she said carefully, but I am ready for more than we have been allowing ourselves. I am ready to admit that I care for you, Orion, deeply, and I want to see where that caring might lead. The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise, transforming his features from harsh to beautiful. That is more than I dared hope for, he said. We will go as slow as you need, Clara. There is no rush. We have all the time in the world. And there, in the flickering firelight, with the mountain night pressing close around the cabin, Clara Calloway Carter took Orion Oakridge's hand in hers and held on tight, anchoring herself to this new future that was beginning to unfold. As summer gave way to early autumn, their relationship deepened and evolved. Orion taught Clara to shoot, patient with her inexperience, his hands steady as he showed her how to hold the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to control her breathing before pulling the trigger. The first time she successfully hit a target, he picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children. He took her on long walks through the mountains, showing her the secret places he had discovered over the years. A waterfall hidden in a narrow canyon, a meadow where elk came to graze at dawn, a cave filled with Native American petroglyphs that made Clara's breath catch with their ancient beauty. This land has so many stories, she said, tracing her fingers over the rock art. So much history that most people will never see. That is why I love it here, Orion said. Everything feels real and honest. No pretenses, no games, just survival and beauty and truth. They were standing close together in the cool dimness of the cave, and Clara turned to find Orion looking at her with an intensity that made her stomach flip. What are you thinking? She asked softly. I am thinking that you are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen in these mountains, he said. And I am thinking that I am falling in love with you, Clara Carter. Not thinking, actually. I have already fallen. I'm just trying to figure out if I should tell you that or keep it to myself a while longer. Clara's breath caught. This was the moment, she realized, the moment where everything changed or stayed the same. She could step back, could ask for more time, could retreat into the safety of grief and memory. Or she could step forward into uncertainty and possibility, and this overwhelming feeling that had been building in her chest for weeks. Appa. I am glad you told me, she said, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the roughness of his beard against her palm. Because I am falling in love with you, too. I did not think I could, not so soon, not after everything. But you have shown me that the heart is bigger than we give it credit for. It can hold grief and joy at the same time. It can honor the past and embrace the future. And my heart, Orion Oakridge, is choosing to embrace you. He kissed her then, finally, a kiss that started gentle and deepened into something that spoke of all the weeks of restraint, all the careful distance they had been maintaining. His arms came around her, pulling her against the solid wall of his chest, and Clara melted into him, feeling safe and cherished and utterly alive. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Orion rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. "I want to court you properly, marry you if you will have me, build a real life with you. Not just you staying here as my housekeeper, but as my partner, my wife, my everything." "Are you proposing to me in a cave?" Clara asked, laughing and crying at the same time. "I suppose I am," Orion said, grinning. "Though if you want me to do it more formally, I can. Get down on one knee, give a speech, the whole thing." "Yes," Clara said simply. "I do not need a formal proposal or a speech. I just need you and this moment and the promise of all the moments to come. Yes, Orion, I will marry you." They rode back to the cabin in a haze of happiness, stopping frequently to kiss, to laugh, to simply look at each other with wonder. When they arrived, Orion lifted Clara down from her horse and held her for a long moment. "We should do this properly," he said. "I want to take you back to Belmont, let the preacher marry us official, make sure no one can ever question the legitimacy of our union." Clara hesitated. "I do not care what people in Belmont think." "I know, but I do. I want everyone to know you are my wife, that I honor you and cherish you. I want there to be no whispers, no rumors, nothing that could ever tarnish your reputation. When would we go? Next week? That gives us time to prepare, and the weather should still be good for travel. We can make it a trip, stay a few days, get whatever supplies we need for winter." Clara agreed, and the week passed in a blur of preparations. She used some of the fabric Orion had bought her to sew a new dress, a beautiful deep blue that brought out her eyes. It was not traditional bridal white, but Clara had already worn white once for a wedding, and that marriage had ended in tragedy. This dress, this color, felt like a new beginning. The night before they were to leave for Belmont, Clara stood in front of the small mirror in her room, studying her reflection. She looked different than she had 3 months ago. There was color in her cheeks, strength in her shoulders, hope in her eyes. She was still Clara Carter, still carried Thomas's name in memory, but she was becoming something more too, growing into this new version of herself that could embrace love after loss. A soft knock on her door pulled her from her reverie. "Come in," she called. Orion entered, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I wanted to give you something," he said, holding out a small wooden box. "My mother gave this to me before I left Missouri. It was her mother's, and her mother's before that. She said to save it for when I found someone worthy of it." Clara opened the box to find a delicate gold ring, old and worn smooth with time, but beautiful in its simplicity. "Orion, I cannot take your family heirloom." "You can and you will," he said firmly. "You are going to be my family, Clara. This ring belongs with you." He took it from the box and slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "There. Now you are claimed, even before the preacher makes it official." Clara looked down at the ring, then up at this man who had somehow become her entire world, and felt her heart overflow with love. "Stay with me tonight?" she asked softly. "Just to sleep, to hold me. I do not want to spend our last night in this cabin apart." "Are you sure?" Orion asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I am sure." They lay together in her small bed, Orion's large frame curled around hers, his arms holding her safe and close. It was intimate without being improper, comforting in a way Clara had not realized she needed. As she drifted toward sleep, she felt Orion's lips against her hair. "I love you," he whispered. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret this," Clara murmured back. "You saved me, Orion. In every way a person can be saved." The journey to Belmont the next morning was filled with excited chatter and planning. They discussed what they would need for winter, how they might expand the cabin come spring, whether they should think about starting a family soon or wait a while. Everything felt possible, the future spreading out before them bright with promise. But as they rode into town, Clara felt some of her happiness dim. The looks they received were not welcoming. People stared, whispered behind their hands, made their judgment clear without saying a word. "Ignore them," Orion said, his jaw tight with anger. "We are here for us, not for them." They went straight to the church, where the preacher, a kind-faced man named Reverend Michaels, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Oakridge, Mrs. Carter, I heard you might be coming. I would be honored to perform your marriage ceremony." "You heard?" Clara asked, confused. Pete the trader mentioned it when he came through last week, said you two were suited for each other, that he had never seen Orion so happy. Reverend Michael smiled. I must say, I am pleased. You have both known hardship, and you deserve happiness. The ceremony was scheduled for the next afternoon, giving Clara time to visit Thomas's grave one last time before she became Orion's wife. She went alone, needing this moment of privacy, needing to make her peace with the past before she stepped fully into the future. The headstone Orion had paid for stood proud and clean, Thomas's name carved deep into the limestone. Clara knelt beside the grave and laid her hand on the cool stone. I'm getting married tomorrow, she said softly, to the man who made sure you had this marker, who gave you dignity when no one else would. I think you would like him, Thomas. He is strong and kind, and he makes me feel safe. I hope you understand. I hope you do not think I am betraying you. I will always love you, always carry you in my heart, but I have to keep living, and I think maybe living means learning to love again. The wind rustled through the cemetery, and Clara chose to interpret it as blessing, as Thomas telling her it was all right to move forward. She stood, brushed the dust from her dress, and walked back into town with her head held high. The next afternoon, wearing her new blue dress with wildflowers that Orion had picked for her woven into her hair, Clara Carter married Orion Oakridge in the little church in Belmont. There were few witnesses, just Pete the trader, and a few of the miners who had known Thomas, men who seemed genuinely happy for her second chance at happiness. When Reverend Michaels pronounced them husband and wife, Orion kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Mrs. Oakridge, he murmured against her lips, my wife. My husband, she replied, testing out the words, finding they fit perfectly. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson having softened enough to give them her best room at a reduced rate. It was the first time they truly came together as husband and wife, and Orion was patient and gentle, taking his time to learn what brought her pleasure, murmuring words of love and devotion against her skin. Afterward, lying tangled together in the narrow bed, Clara traced the scars on Orion's chest, evidence of his hard life in the wilderness. I cannot believe you are mine, she said. I have been yours since the moment I saw you fighting for your husband's dignity, Orion replied, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. I just did not know it yet. They stayed in Belmont 3 more days, buying supplies and letting people adjust to the reality of their marriage. On the second day, they encountered Silas Greer on the street. The Undertaker looked at them with barely concealed disdain. Mrs. Carter, he said pointedly, ignoring her new name. I'm surprised to see you have recovered from your grief so quickly. 3 months is hardly a decent mourning period. Orion stepped forward, putting himself between Clara and Greer, and the Undertaker actually took a step back. Orion was not a violent man, but there was no mistaking the threat in his posture. Her name is Mrs. Oakridge now, he said quietly, and her mourning period, her choices and her life are none of your concern. If I ever hear that you have spoken disrespectfully about my wife again, we will have a very different conversation. Am I clear? Greer paled. Perfectly clear. As they walked away, Clara slipped her hand into Orion's. You did not have to do that. Yes, I did. No one gets to make you feel ashamed for choosing to live, for choosing happiness. Not him, not anyone. By the time they headed back to the cabin, Clara felt like they had weathered their first test as a married couple. The townspeople could think what they wanted. All that mattered was that they had each other. The winter that followed was the happiest of Clara's life. Snow came early and heavy, blanketing their mountain valley in white, but the cabin was warm and cozy, and she and Orion fell into an easy domestic rhythm that felt right in a way nothing else ever had. Orion taught her how to tan hides and prepare pelts, skills that would help them earn money come spring. Clara continued her sewing, making clothes for both of them and creating quilts that would keep them warm through the coldest months. In the evenings, they read or talked or simply sat together, content in each other's presence. And at night, they came together with a passion and tenderness that only grew deeper as they learned each other's bodies and hearts. Clara discovered that Orion, despite his rough exterior, was an attentive and generous lover, more concerned with her pleasure than his own. and Orion found in Clara a willing partner, a woman who met his desire with her own, who was not afraid to ask for what she wanted. In late January, Clara realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another month to be certain before telling Orion, but when she did, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. "A baby," he whispered, his large hands spanning her still flat stomach with wonder. "We're going to have a baby. In late summer, I think. August, maybe September." Clara searched his face anxiously. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" Orion swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "Clara, I am beyond happy. I am going to be a father. We are going to be a family." He set her down gently, suddenly worried. "I did not hurt you, did I? I should be more careful. You should probably not be doing heavy work anymore. We need to make sure you are eating enough and resting enough and—" "Orion," Clara interrupted, laughing. "I am pregnant, not made of glass. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time. I will be fine." But Orion was already in full protective mode, insisting she sit down while he made dinner, that she let him take over more of the chores, that she rest whenever she felt tired. It was endearing and exasperating in equal measure, but Clara loved him for it, loved that he cared so much. As spring arrived and the snow began to melt, they made plans for the future. Orion wanted to expand the cabin, add another room for the baby, and perhaps eventually more children. Clara wanted to start a garden, grow their own vegetables to supplement the game Orion hunted. "We could maybe think about building closer to town," Orion suggested one evening. "Not in Belmont itself, but near enough that you would have neighbors, that our child could have other children to play with and eventually go to school." Clara looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, the place where she had healed and found love again. "Would you be happy closer to town? I know you value your solitude." "I valued solitude when I was alone," Orion said, pulling her into his lap. "But I'm not alone anymore. I have you, and soon we will have our child. That changes everything. I want our children to have opportunities, to have friends and education and choices. If that means giving up some of my isolation, it is a small price to pay." They decided to spend one more winter in the mountain cabin, to give Clara time to have the baby in the place where she felt safest, and then next spring they would start looking for land closer to civilization. As her pregnancy progressed, Clara bloomed. The morning sickness that plagued her first few months gave way to a glowing health, and Orion could not keep his hands off her expanding belly, talking to the baby, telling it stories about the mountains and the life they would have together. "I am going to teach you to fish," he said one night, his lips pressed against Clara's stomach, "and to track game, and to read the weather in the clouds, and your mama is going to teach you to read and sew and think for yourself. You are going to be the smartest, bravest child in all of Nevada." "What if it is a girl?" Clara asked, running her fingers through his hair. "Will you be disappointed?" Orion looked up at her, his expression fierce. "I do not care if we have a boy or a girl. All I care is that the baby is healthy and you are safe. Although," he added thoughtfully, "a daughter with your spirit and stubbornness would be something to see. I would probably spend half my life chasing away potential suitors," Clara laughed. "And a son with your size and strength would be formidable. We will love whatever child God gives us." In late August, as the summer heat began to soften toward autumn, Clara went into labor. Orion had ridden to Belmont 2 weeks earlier to fetch the doctor and a midwife, and both had agreed to stay at a nearby farm and be on call when the time came. When Clara's pains started in the early morning hours, Orion rode like the wind to fetch them. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and there were moments when Orion, pacing outside the cabin while the midwife and doctor worked, thought he might go mad with worry. He could hear Clara crying out in pain, and every sound was like a knife to his heart. He had faced mountain lions and blizzards and every danger the wilderness had to offer, but nothing had prepared him for the terror of knowing the woman he loved was suffering, and he could do nothing to help. Finally, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, he heard a different sound, the thin, reedy cry of a newborn baby. A moment later, the midwife opened the door, her face creased in a smile. "You have a son, Mr. Oakridge, a big, healthy boy, and your wife is tired but doing well. Come meet your child." Orion stumbled into the cabin to find Clara propped up in bed, looking exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. When she looked up and saw him, her smile was brilliant. "Come meet our son," she said softly. Orion approached the bed like he was in a dream, looking down at the tiny face peeking out from the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that, when they blinked open, were the same gray-green as Clara's. He was perfect, absolutely perfect, and Orion felt something shift in his chest, an expansion of love so profound it almost hurt. "Can I hold him?" he asked, his voice breaking. Clara carefully transferred the baby into his arms, and Orion marveled at how small he was, how light, how utterly vulnerable. This tiny person was depending on him and Clara for everything, and the responsibility of it was overwhelming and wonderful all at once. "What should we name him?" Clara asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking down at his son, Orion knew exactly what felt right. "I want to name him Thomas," he said, "after your first husband. He deserves to be remembered, and this seems like a good way to honor him." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Are you certain? I do not want you to feel like you are competing with his memory." "I am not competing. Thomas was part of your life, part of your story, and because of him, you became the woman I fell in love with. Our son can carry his name proudly." "Thomas Oakridge," Clara said, testing the name. "I love it, but I want his middle name to be Orion, after his father, Thomas Orion Oakridge." Orion leaned down to kiss her, careful not to jostle the baby. "Perfect. He is absolutely perfect, just like his mother." The months that followed were exhausting and exhilarating. Baby Thomas was a good baby, healthy and strong, and he grew quickly under their watchful care. Orion proved to be a natural father, patient with the crying, eager to help with feedings and changings, constantly making Clara laugh with his running commentary to their son. "All right, little man, this is how you change a diaper without getting sprayed. It is all about the timing. You have to be quick." The statement was immediately followed by Orion yelping, as Thomas did exactly what he had been warning about, and Clara dissolved into giggles. But beneath the joy, there was also challenge. The cabin felt smaller with three of them, especially as Thomas began to grow and become more active. And Clara, despite her love for the mountain sanctuary, found herself longing for other women to talk to, for a community to be part of. When spring came and Thomas was 8 months old, they began seriously planning their move. Orion rode into Belmont and the surrounding areas, looking for suitable land. He finally found a parcel about 5 miles outside of town, close enough to be part of the community, but far enough to maintain some privacy. There was good water, fertile soil for farming, and plenty of timber for building. He purchased the land with money he had saved from years of trapping, and they began the process of building a new home. It was hard work, made harder by needing to care for Thomas at the same time, but they approached it as a family project, as building their future together. The new house was larger than the cabin, with 3 bedrooms and a real kitchen and a porch that faced west to catch the sunset. Clara planted her garden, and Orion built a barn for animals. They made friends with their neighbors, other families trying to carve out lives in the Nevada territory, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Clara felt like she was part of something larger than herself. On their second wedding anniversary, Orion gave Clara a gift, a new headstone for Thomas Carter's grave. This one was larger than the first, made of polished granite, and bore the inscription, "Thomas Carter, beloved first husband of Clara, may his memory be a blessing." "I wanted him to be properly honored," Orion explained as they stood together in the Belmont cemetery, their son playing nearby. "I wanted there to be no question that you loved him, that he mattered, that his life had meaning." Clara leaned into her husband, her heart full to bursting. "How did I get so lucky as to find you?" "I am the lucky one," Orion corrected. "You took a broken, lonely mountain man and gave him a reason to live, a family to cherish, a future to build toward. Every day with you is a gift I never expected to receive." Over the years that followed, they built a life together that was everything Clara had dreamed of, and more. They had 3 more children, 2 daughters and another son, and their home was filled with laughter and love and the chaos that comes with a growing family. Orion never lost his love for the mountains, taking the children on camping trips and teaching them the skills he had learned in his years of solitude. But he always came home, always chose them, always made sure they knew they were his priority. Clara's sewing business grew, and she became known throughout the territory for her skill with a needle. She took on apprentices, teaching young women the trade, giving them the same kind of opportunities she had needed so desperately when she was widowed and alone. They never forgot Thomas Carter. His name lived on in their oldest son, and every year on the anniversary of his death, they would visit his grave as a family and tell the children stories about the man who had loved their mother first, the man whose death had inadvertently brought their parents together. He was a good man, Clara would always say, and he deserved better than the pauper's grave they wanted to give him. Your father made sure he was honored, and that is part of why I fell in love with him. And the children would look at the grave with its fine granite headstone, and then at their father with his broad shoulders and gentle hands, and they would understand that love could come in different forms, that honoring the past and embracing the future were not contradictory, that their family was built on foundations of respect and kindness and second chances. On a crisp autumn evening, when Clara was 42 and Orion was 46, they sat together on their porch, watching the sunset over the mountains. Their children were all in bed, the house was clean, and for a moment they had peace. "Do you ever miss it?" Clara asked, her head resting on Orion's shoulder. "The solitude of the cabin, the simplicity of that life?" "Sometimes," Orion admitted, "but then I think about everything I would have missed if I had stayed alone in those mountains. I would have missed you, missed our children, missed this entire beautiful, complicated, wonderful life we have built together. And I realize that solitude was not peace, it was just emptiness waiting to be filled." Clara turned to kiss him, this man who had saved her in more ways than she could count, this mountain man who had proven that strength and gentleness could coexist, that paying for a headstone for a stranger's husband could lead to a love story that would last a lifetime. "I love you," she said. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you," Orion replied, pulling her closer. "You are my heart, Clara Oakridge. You and our children are everything I never knew I needed." As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Nevada sky, they sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other in the midst of grief and built something beautiful from the ashes of loss. The Undertaker had wanted to bury Thomas Carter in a pauper's grave, forgotten and unmarked. Instead, a mountain man had paid for a proper headstone, and in doing so had set in motion a love story that would echo through generations. Their eldest son, Thomas, would grow up to be a doctor, using his grandfather's and father's names with pride, serving the communities scattered across Nevada with the same kindness and dignity that had characterized his father's intervention all those years ago. His siblings would build their own lives, carrying forward the values their parents had instilled, the importance of honoring the past, the courage to embrace the future, and the understanding that true strength lies in choosing compassion over indifference. And years later, when Clara and Orion were old and gray, sitting on that same porch with grandchildren playing in the yard, they would still tell the story of how they met. About an undertaker who wanted to save money and a mountain man who believed everyone deserved dignity in death. About grief and healing and the unexpected ways love can find us when we least expect it. "Your grandmother was the bravest person I ever met," Orion would say, his voice roughened by age but no less full of love. "She had lost everything, but she held her head high and fought for what was right. That is when I knew she was special." "And your grandfather was the kindest," Clara would add, her hand finding his across the space between their rocking chairs, fingers intertwining with the ease of 50 years of practice. "He gave me back my dignity, my hope, and my life. And then he gave me love, a family, and a home." The grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, this story never getting old no matter how many times they heard it. And when Clara and Orion were finally laid to rest in the Belmont cemetery, side by side with a view of the mountains they both loved, their headstones would be grand and beautiful, etched with words of love and legacy. But nearby, carefully tended by their descendants, would stand another stone, older and simpler. Thomas Carter, beloved husband, taken too soon. Because this was the truth of their story. Three people, connected by death and remembrance and the simple act of choosing to honor rather than forget. The Undertaker had wanted to bury a man in a pauper's grave, erasing him from memory and history. Instead, a mountain man had paid for a proper headstone and changed the course of multiple lives in the process. Love, Clara and Orion learned and taught their children, was not a finite resource that ran out when given. It expanded, encompassing more people and more stories, weaving together past and present into something resilient and beautiful. Thomas Carter's death had been a tragedy, but from that tragedy had grown a family, a legacy, and a love story that proved that even in our darkest moments, there is possibility for light. The mountains stood eternal, witnesses to countless human stories of struggle and survival, loss and love. And in their shadows, the descendants of Clara Calloway Carter and Orion Oakridge would continue to live and thrive, carrying forward the lesson that their grandparents had learned on that fateful day in 1878. That choosing compassion, that fighting for dignity, that honoring the dead while embracing the living, these were the acts that made life meaningful. The Undertaker's name was forgotten over time, lost to history's indifference. But the mountain man who paid for a headstone and the widow who fought to honor her husband's memory, their names were spoken with love and respect for generations. Their story became legend in Belmont and beyond, a reminder that our choices matter, that our kindness echoes long after we are gone, and that sometimes the greatest love stories begin in the most unexpected ways. And so, the story ends as all good stories should, with love conquering grief, with family flourishing where there was once solitude, with hope emerging from despair. Clara and Orion Oakridge lived long, full lives, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew they were loved, who understood their worth, and who carried forward the legacy of that spring day in 1878 when a mountain man walked into an undertaker's parlor and decided that everyone, even a poor dead miner, deserved to be remembered. The end.